Hey guys, what's up? It's Savannah. Welcome back to my channel and welcome back to another true crime episode here on my YouTube channel. As you guys can tell by the title of today's video, today we are talking about the brutal murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. James was murdered on February 12th, 1993 in Liverpool, England. I know I said this about last week's case as well, being one of the most crazy cases that I've ever covered, but this definitely falls into that category as well. So we're just gonna jump right on into it today. We're gonna get straight to it, so let's get started. This is James Bulger. James Patrick Bulger was born on March 16th, 1990 to his parents Ralph and Denise Bulger. James was described as your typical 2-year-old boy. He loved playing with his toys and playing with his friends. He had a great sense of humor. James was such a character. And just to give you a little bit of insight on his sense of humor, James' dad's name is Ralph. And obviously going through day-to-day life, he would hear his father be called Ralph instead of Dad. So in turn, James would like to joke around with his dad and call him Ralph instead of Dad. He definitely had his own sense of humor and was really coming into his own and forming his own personality. James was such a beautiful little boy. He had brown hair. He had a smile that would light up any room that he walked into. His mom, Denise, also described him in that same way as a character. He was always laughing and trying to make other people laugh, and he was super charismatic. So let's jump to Friday, February 12th, 1993. So on this particular day, James and his mother Denise ended up going to the New Strand Shopping Center, which is located in Merseyside. So James went to the mall with his mom Denise, and at about 3:30 p.m. Denise and James walked into a butcher's shop. And this butcher's shop was located on the ground level, so the first floor of the mall. And James and his mom walked in, and Denise picked up a couple things that she needed, went to the cash register. James was standing right by her side. After she had checked out with the items that she had purchased, Denise turned back around and realized that James was gone. So when Denise noticed that James was not standing right next to her, she immediately went into a full-blown panic. She alerted all of the employees right away, who immediately called the police, and the police actually showed up to the mall within 30 minutes. So they were there right away, and in the midst of those 30 minutes, Denise was scouring the mall trying to find James, but she was unable to do so. Now, when police arrived at the mall, they tried to talk to Denise. They were trying to get a description of James, trying to see what exactly happened that led up to him disappearing, but Denise was absolutely distraught. Something to note about Denise, which comes into her protectiveness over James, is that before James was born, Denise was actually pregnant and ended up giving birth to a stillborn daughter. And so because of that traumatic experience, she was so protective over James. So the fact that James was nowhere to be found, she didn't know where her son was, this was her absolute worst nightmare, as it is for any parent. When Denise did finally start talking to police, she told them that James was not the type of kid that would just walk off on his own. He knew better than that. He wouldn't just wander off without telling his mom where he was going. And from an authorities standpoint, they thought it was really possible that James could have got distracted by something. He could have wandered into another store. He could have been hiding at this point because he was worried about the commotion going on. The chaos could have scared him. So the authorities were hopeful that they would be able to find James in this mall at first. However, when 5:30 p.m. rolled around and the shopping center was closing, that was the closing hours for it, and James still wasn't found, authorities started to get a little bit more concerned. And as hours kept on passing and day turned into night, that is when they realized that something really bad could have happened to James. So the first thing that authorities decided that they needed to do was they decided that they needed to look at the surveillance footage from this mall. Now, in the New Strand Shopping Center, there are 16 cameras, or there were at the time. So authorities spent the entire first night that James went missing scouring through this surveillance footage, trying to see if they could figure out where James had gone. And they were very, very shocked when they figured out what they had found. So the surveillance footage that was timestamped at 3:39 p.m. shows James leaving the butcher shop, and just 1 minute later at 3:40 p.m. does Denise turn around and realize that James is gone. but at that point, it is already too late. Now, the surveillance shows James walking out of the butcher shop, and by the time Denise notices that he's gone, James is already on the top floor of the shopping center, and he is not walking alone. The surveillance footage showed James walking with two what appeared to be teenage boys. Now, one of the boys is holding James's hand, escorting him out of the mall, and the other seems to be leading them both through the crowd to kind of direct which way that they're supposed to go. And by 3:43 p.m. on February 12th, the boys had successfully left the mall with James. So the entire night of February 12th was spent searching for James. Authorities searched all throughout the mall and throughout all of the surrounding areas. Like I said, the discovery of the surveillance footage wasn't made until around midnight on Friday, the day that James went missing. So technically that is Saturday. So now that leads us into Saturday, February 13th, and authorities still were unable to find James. And at this point, he had been missing for about 19 hours. And we talk about statistics a lot on this channel and the statistics of a child who goes missing. Obviously, the sooner you find them, the better, but it is a very crucial time. The first 24 hours are extremely crucial in a child abduction. So by the time that it reached the 19-hour mark, authorities knew that they were really working against the clock here. So authorities decided the next best thing to do would be to hold a press conference. They held a press conference that included James's parents, and they spoke at the conference, and they basically just pleaded for James's safe return, and the authorities spoke as well and really urged anyone in the public who knew any possible information to come forward. They did show the surveillance footage at this press conference, but the quality of the camera was really just terrible. It was really grainy. It wasn't good. You couldn't really make out what these boys looked like. All authorities really chalked them up to be, based off of what they could see, is they assumed that these boys were white teenage boys within the age range of 13 to 15. So because this was the profile they were working with, authorities ended up interviewing about 60 different boys between the ages of 13 and 15, but all of these interviews basically led them to dead ends and honestly really affected the lives of the boys that they were interviewing. One family even had to completely uproot their entire life and move because they were being harassed so much when people found out that this boy had been interviewed by the police, but he actually had absolutely nothing to do with this. He was just interviewed by authorities, and the public caught on to it, and him and his entire family had to move because of it. So this was definitely affecting people very heavily, and I think a big part of that is because no one could understand this. No one understood why two teenage boys would be leading a 2-year-old boy out of a mall. But on the flip side of this definitely did give authorities some hope that James might still be alive, because with two teenage boys, authorities thought, how threatening could they possibly be? You know, how much harm could they possibly do? These boys didn't appear to be any type of threat, which led authorities to be very hopeful in this situation. After the press conference, the investigation and the search continued. There were up to 100 law enforcement personnel who were working on this search, searching railways, searching the canal, searching alleys, searching dump sites, searching everywhere, but they still were not able to find James. So now we move on to February 14th, 1993. So that is Valentine's Day, and authorities are still working day in and day out on this case. It has now been almost a full 48 hours since James has been missing, so that 24-hour mark has been passed. So on February 14th, at the Walton Police Department, there was a boy who came running in full speed ahead into this police station, telling the authorities that he found what he believed to be a body on the train tracks. He was with a group of his friends. They were walking on the train tracks, and they stumbled across what appeared to be a body, and that is when this boy ran into the police station to let the police know. And once authorities heard about this, they immediately all got together and went down to the tracks together. Now, these train tracks were about 3 miles away from the shopping center that James was last seen at with his mom before he went missing. So authorities went down to the train tracks, and they confirmed that there was a body found, and they contacted James's family, and James's parents couldn't bear to see the possibility of their son. At that point, the body hadn't been confirmed yet, and they couldn't bear to see their son, their 2-year-old son, their baby, being dead. So it was actually James's uncle who was the one who confirmed that it was James's body who was found. Now, when James's body was found, the scene was was absolutely horrific. He had been hit by a train, and because of that, his body had been ripped in half. It had ripped into two pieces. So at first glance, one would think that this could have been an accident. You know, James just could have walked in front of a train not knowing and gotten hit, and ultimately is what led to his death. However, it was all of the other injuries that James sustained that made police realize that this was no accident at all. So James suffered from 42 injuries overall. He had 22 cuts and bruises and grazes on his face, and then he had 20 injuries all over his body. The medical examiner was able to conclude that James had been hit with bricks and with stones. They were also able to conclude that he had 10 skull fractures at the time of his death, which was the result of him being hit over the head with a 22-pound iron bar. James's injuries were so severe that the medical examiner wasn't able to figure out what exactly caused his death. The cause of death was ruled as beating. James was beaten to death. However, they weren't able to figure out what exact injury was the one that led to his death because there was so many of them. The medical examiner was also able to conclude that after James was tortured, he was then placed onto train tracks, and he was actually weighted down, so that way he wouldn't get up and he would be hit by the train. And I don't mean to say fortunately, because I don't feel like that there's nothing about this that is like a fortunate situation. Obviously, this is absolutely horrific, but James was dead. He succumbed to his injuries before he was hit by the train. The train hit happened post-mortem, so he was already passed away by that point. James was also found with batteries shoved into his mouth, and police also do believe that there was a sexual component involved in this as well. They do believe that James was sexually assaulted. When James's body was discovered, all clothes of his below the waist had been removed. So before we move on to the investigation portion of this, I want to talk about how big of an effect James's death had on everyone in Liverpool, but also on everyone who heard about this case. No one who heard about this case was not just gutted by it. This case was all over the media, and every single person was talking about it. Literally everyone was talking about James Bulger. How could you not? This was a 2-year-old boy who had been brutally murdered. James's death definitely caused a uproar in parents being protective over their children. A lot of parents became a lot more protective. You know those little leashes that you see sometimes with parents walking around and their kids are on leashes? These leashes were going out of stock. Everyone was buying them because everyone was so afraid for their child's safety. After James's body was discovered, authorities held another press conference announcing that they had found James's body, and they asked again for anyone who knew any information on either of the boys that James was with to come forward and say something. No information was too small. They were literally looking for anything at this point. Now, this plea to the public ended up leading to 38 witnesses coming forward claiming that they saw James the day that he disappeared with 2 boys. There are people who said that they saw James just walking with the 2 boys. There's people who said that they saw James screaming and crying with these 2 boys but just didn't do anything about it. There's people who say that they saw James with blood on his face, and when he was approached, the 2 boys that he was with said that he was fine and not to worry about it. There's an instance where a woman literally walked up to James and told the boys that she was going to take him to the police station, but the boys insisted that they were going to do it themselves, so she just assumed that that was what was going to happen and she walked away. There was a witness who claimed to see James getting kicked in the stomach for not following orders as suggested. The point is that 38 people saw this boy with these other 2 boys, and he was screaming and he was crying and he was getting kicked and there was blood, and no one did anything. And the reason for that, and this all circles back to what we just talked about a couple minutes ago, was because these boys are the least threatening type of people that you would see. No one thinks when you see a 2-year-old walking with 2 young boys that something is wrong. You think it's a friend, you think it's a brother, a family member, something like that. You never assume that. Things would be so much different if James was walking with a group of men, or if James was walking with one adult male that looked a little sketchy. You know, things would be a lot different, but these boys seemed so non-threatening. So on the night of February 15th, just one day after James's body was discovered, there had been a woman who had called into the authorities who said that she believed she knew who was on the surveillance tapes with James. She told police that she recognized one of the boys in the surveillance footage because he had actually skipped school with his friend that day. Remember, it was a Friday, so she said that he had actually skipped school with his friend that day. So because of this woman's statement, these boys boys automatically became the authorities' new lead to go off of. And this woman was able to identify these two boys as being 10-year-old Robert Thompson and 10-year-old Jon Venables. According to the woman who called in, these two boys were known for skipping school and getting into mischief and causing trouble. They were always into some sort of trouble, and this threw police completely through a loop, because at first they thought that they were dealing with someone who was 13 to 15, or two boys who were 13 to 15, and that for them was very, very young and shockingly young. But to have two boys who were both 10 years old, it was almost unbelievable to police. They didn't want to believe it at first. However, after doing some investigating and doing some digging, authorities were ready to make an arrest and bring in Jon and Robert. So before we get into the next part of this, let's talk a little bit about who these boys were. So Robert Thompson was 10 years old at this time, and he lived in Walton, which is not far from where James was murdered at all. And Robert definitely had a tough upbringing. It was not easy for him whatsoever. He was one of 7 boys. He had 4 older brothers and 2 younger brothers, and he lived in a small house with his 2 younger brothers and his mother. His 4 older brothers at this point had gone off and started their own lives, so it was Robert and his 2 younger brothers and his mom. As far as Robert's father goes, he was incredibly abusive towards Robert's mother. The boys watched their father beat up their mother constantly before he ultimately ended up leaving his mother for the woman he was having an affair with, which was a woman he met on a family vacation. So with the rest of his family, he meets this woman, has an affair, and ends up leaving his wife and family for this woman. Now, after their father left, it definitely put a huge strain on their mother, because now she was a single mother to 7 boys, and she was not handling this well at all. She really did turn to alcohol in this time of her life. It turned her into an alcoholic, essentially, and because of that, it really left for Robert and his siblings to fend for themselves. And to make matters even worse, 7 weeks after their father left, Robert, his siblings, and his mother were all out during the day one day. They were doing things. I'm not sure what they were doing, but at the time that they got home, their house had actually burnt down. Their house had burnt to the ground. So now Robert's mother was a single mother to 7 kids, and they were homeless. So they ended up staying in a homeless shelter for a little bit before being able to get into a new house, which was really small. It was really cramped. There was barely enough room for them. And so with all things considered, the boys obviously started acting out. They had no real parental figure, and their life was just not going well at that point. And all of the boys ended up kind of turning against each other, which you don't typically see. It's usually, you know, siblings kind of have this pack mentality and they stick together, but these boys kind of turned on each other a little bit, and it was always the oldest would bully the younger one, which would bully the younger one and the younger one, so they would kind of go in chronological order like that. There's stories where they would pull knives out on each other, they would tie each other up in the pigeon yard and leave each other there. Like, they were just not good to each other. And it was said that the older brothers would actually bully the younger brothers if they did go to school. Usually you would think they're gonna bully them if they don't go to school and be like, you have to go get an education, but they bullied them if they did go to school. So they would threaten to beat them up if they did go to school. So sometimes, yeah, they just skipped because they wanted to skip, but there were times where they skipped because they didn't want to get beaten up by their older brothers. And in one school year, Robert ended up missing 49 of the 150 days that are in a school year, and that is huge. Robert was also known to shoplift. He would sometimes shoplift things for his family that his family needed, but he would also shoplift things for himself. He would shoplift toys, and he became really good at it for a 10-year-old. It was kind of like a pastime for him, would be to just go shoplift some things. Now, when the authorities were going to make their arrest, they had one detective go to Robert Thompson's house and another one go to Jon Venables' house, and the detective that went to Robert Thompson's house actually ended up meeting Robert's little brother, and the little brother asked the detective when he was there before Robert came downstairs if this was in regards to James Bulger's murder, and the detective said, you know, yes, it is. Like, how do you know about that? And he said that Robert and his little brother, so the boy that was telling the detective this had actually gone and set out flowers at the memorial that was set up for James. There was a public memorial. Everyone was bringing flowers and gifts and posters and pictures and things like that. And Robert and his brother had actually gone there and placed flowers down at James's memorial. Now, Jon Venables, on the other hand, came from a pretty traditional family in the sense that he had a family unit consisting of his father, his mother, and his two other siblings. He had an older brother and a younger sister, and his father definitely felt like he needed to play the role of the breadwinner in the family. He needed to go out and provide, he needed to get money, and his wife should stay home with the kids and take care of them. Now, Jon's other siblings, both of his siblings, actually had pretty severe disabilities. Jon did not. So because of these learning disabilities that his siblings had, it kind of obviously made his mother pay a little bit more attention to his other siblings, which in turn made Jon feel sometimes like he was being neglected or left out. And while Jon's mother insists that she never played any sort of favoritism or cared about one child over the other or spent more time or attention, and here's the thing, I don't know to the extent of what these disabilities were, but if you have a child with disabilities, you're obviously going to pay a little bit more attention to that child to make sure that they are met with everything that they need, in comparison to if you don't have a child with disabilities. They are able to do some of the things that your other child might not be able to do for themselves. So I think it's obvious that that could have happened. I wouldn't say that that's like an outlandish thing to say. Now, when Jon was 1 year old, his maternal grandfather, so the grandfather on his mom's side, actually ended up passing away, and because of this left his grandmother without a husband, and this really made Jon's mom feel the responsibility to take on taking care of her mother as well. So now she's taking care of all 3 kids of hers as well as her mother, and she actually went to the extent as to packing up all of her stuff and all of her kids' stuff and moving in with her mother to take care of her. Now, Jon's father did not end up going with them when they did this. They claim that they still stayed together, and there are claims out there where they say that they actually got a divorce and they weren't together, so I'm not really sure their marital status. But what I do know is that Jon's father did not end up going with them when they did this, and he actually ended up getting a place for himself. But a couple years later, Jon ended up moving out of his grandmother's house with his mom and his siblings, and they got a different house together, and he was bullied pretty badly by the neighborhood kids when they moved into this new house, mainly because of his siblings. He was bullied for his siblings having these disabilities. And so because of all things considered, Jon started acting out a lot. He started acting out in class. His teachers noticed it. They called him an attention seeker. He would bang his head on the desk. He would scream. He would just do anything to get the attention, and he actually ended up trying to choke out a student with a ruler. He like pushed the ruler up against the other student's throat, and because of that he got suspended for 2 days. But his mother actually didn't think that that was enough punishment, and she kept him home for 10 weeks. So he didn't go to school for 10 weeks, which obviously held him back. So because he missed so much school, he ended up having to transfer schools and get held back a grade, which is ultimately what landed him in the same class as Robert Thompson. That's where the two of them met, and they became best friends right away. I do want to mention that one thing both detectives said when they went to arrest both of these boys was how shocked they were by their size, because obviously, yes, they're 10 years old, they're extremely young, but both detectives described the boys as looking as young as 8 years old. They were extremely small. They looked so young, and that's something that both detectives said about Robert and Jon. So now let's talk about what happened once the boys were arrested. So both boys were arrested and taken to separate police departments. And I want to also say that both detectives who had interviewed Jon and Robert, neither of them had ever interviewed murder suspects that young before. Obviously, they're 10 years old. It's not a common thing to interview a 10-year-old murder suspect. So this was a first for both of them as well. Now, the initial part of the interrogation was basically just the detectives asking the boys questions, trying to figure out their mindset and trying to figure out, more importantly, if they knew the difference between right and wrong. They're trying to figure out if they have a sense of what's right and what's wrong. The detective sergeant who was interviewing Robert asked him if James being killed was right or wrong, to which Robert answered answered it was wrong. Now, when authorities asked Jon where he was the day that James went missing, Jon actually admitted to being in the Newstrand shopping center and said that he actually did see James there as well. And it wasn't until Robert's second interview that he also told police that he was also at the Newstrand Mall with Jon and saw James. Now, where authorities said that they believe Robert had his first slip up was he was able to in detail describe every single thing that James was wearing the day that he went missing. And this struck police as odd because it isn't very often that you find literally anyone, let alone a 10-year-old, to be so meticulous when describing what a person was wearing that they didn't know that day. If you're just walking past someone in the mall, you're not going to know exactly what they were wearing. Now, a slip up from Jon's side, from the detective's standpoint, was when Jon was first arrested, he asked authorities if it was possible to detect fingerprints from someone's skin. I apologize if you can hear a noise in the background right now. It's something to do with the utility closet. It'll go away in a second. Okay, it just went away. It'll probably come back, but just bear with me. So when Jon asked authorities this question about being able to detect fingerprints, they knew that obviously there was more to that statement than just asking a simple question like that. No person who doesn't have anything to hide is going to ask if you can detect fingerprints off of someone's skin. There's going to be more to the story than just that simple question. So that's where they believed that Jon made his first slip up. By Friday, February 19th, so now a week after James had been murdered, both of the boys started talking about what really happened that day. And ultimately what ended up happening was both boys started turning on each other. Robert said it was more Jon who was responsible, and Jon said that Robert was more of the ringleader in all of this. But according to Robert, he said that him, James, and Jon walked out of the mall that day and walked to the train tracks. He said that even though he himself was a part of taking James from the mall and leading him to the train tracks, he actually ended up leaving before the actual torture and beatings started, so he was not actually a part of the murder of James. He was just a part of the abduction. And with Jon, it was the complete opposite. He said that him and Robert took James from the mall and they walked him to the train tracks. They started throwing the paint at him, but then Jon ended up leaving and Robert was actually the one who murdered James. So basically both boys were just trying to accuse each other at this point to maintain their innocence, but authorities were not buying it. So police believe what happened was that on the afternoon of Friday, February 12th, Robert and Jon abducted James from the Newstrand shopping center, walked with him for 3 miles until they stumbled across the train track, and that is when they began their torture and beatings of James before laying him on the train tracks, which is when he ended up dying before getting hit by the train. But the boys actually admitted to the authorities that this was not their original plan. Their original plan was actually to abduct a child from the mall that day and walk them out into the street and push them in front of a car or a taxi. That way they would just die right then and there. However, when this plan deemed unsuccessful, they ended up walking him to the train tracks. They also thought about drowning James at one point. However, when they realized that wasn't going to work either, that's when they decided that the train tracks were the best place to bring him. Trial began on November 1st, 1993 in Preston, and it was 8 months after James's murder. Now, this was such a widely known case. Everyone was talking about it. It was all over the news and the media. So the first day of the trial, there were 500 people who were waiting outside of the courthouse to listen to this trial. Now, both boys pled not guilty to the charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction, and the attempted abduction charge actually came from earlier that day on February 12th when Robert and Jon tried to abduct a different boy. However, this boy's mother turned around and saw what was happening and walked her son away, so both boys were being charged with attempted abduction as well. Now, as far as the day of February 12th and leading up to James's abduction, what ended up happening was Jon was walking to school this day, and he was walking to school to pick up gerbils. I don't know if you guys ever had this when you were in school, but sometimes if you have a class pet, you can sign up to take the class pet home for the weekend and take care of it. So Jon had signed up for this particular weekend to take care of these gerbils. Now, while he was walking to school, he ended up running into Robert, and Robert decided that day that he was not going to be going to school, and instead he was going to go shoplifting at the shopping center instead, and he told Jon that he should come with him. Now, this was something that Jon and Robert did quite frequently. They shoplifted shoplifted together a lot, so it didn't take too much convincing for Jon to agree to also skip school and go to the shopping center with Robert. Now, when the boys were at the shopping center, they started, shoplifting a little bit, but they realized that this was getting kind of boring. They had done it so many times and they were just kind of reaching a point where they were over it. So while they were at the mall, Robert turned to Jon and told him, "Let's take a kid," which is when the two of them decided on this plan of abducting a child. Again, they tried to abduct one boy before they actually abducted James, and then they ended up taking James out of the mall. Now, the prosecution really set this up to make it look like Robert was the ringleader here. He was the one that kind of conducted this whole thing, but it was argued that Jon was the one who suggested that they go to the train tracks, which is where James's body was found. And as far as evidence goes, there were multiple pieces of James's DNA on both of the boys, as well as blue paint that had been found in James's eye. That blue paint had also been found on Jon and Robert's clothing as well. Now, this trial lasted about 17 days, and after the 17 days were up, the jury was set out to deliberate on a verdict. And the deliberation lasted about 6 hours, and when the jury came back, they found Robert Thompson and Jon Venables both guilty of all charges against them. So that's the charge of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction. Now, here's what you need to know about this trial and this case in general, and that is that Robert and Jon's names at this point were not released to the public. They were referred to as Child A and Child B, and that was for what law enforcement said, the safety of Robert and Jon. They thought that it would be better to protect their identities. That way people wouldn't try to go after them for what they did to James. It would just make everything a lot easier for everyone involved. And it wasn't until after the trial where the judge decided that he was not going to let the boys go without having their identities released. And so he did the controversial thing, which was he ended up releasing the boys' names, Robert Thompson and Jon Venables, as well as their school picture. So now their pictures and their names were both released to the public, something that was not done before. Some people thought that this was a really good idea and some people were not really for it, and we'll get into that argument a little bit later. Now, when it came to the sentencing, this is where it gets tricky. So both boys were initially charged with 8 years. So they only get 8 years in prison, or juvie essentially, for the murder of James. Now, this had a lot of people upset, obviously, because of the nature of James's murder, and they're only getting 8 years. Like, there's people who have drug offenses, like minor drug offenses, that are in jail for longer than that. Basically, what ended up happening is Denise really fought this sentence to get it raised, and so it got raised to 10 years. So instead of 8 years in prison, it was 10 years in prison, and then it got raised again to 15 years. However, it got raised by the government, not by criminal lawyers. So even though they were given a 15-year sentence, that sentence was then retracted. So then it got brought back down to 10 years. So both boys were sentenced to 10 years in juvie. Robert Thompson was held at the Barton Moss Secure Care Center in Manchester, and Jon Venables was detained in the Vardy House, which is a small 8-bedded unit at the Red Bank Secure Unit in St. Helens on Merseyside. The location of where the boys were staying was not released to the public while they were in there for obvious reasons. And I want to talk about the way that these boys were living, because both boys were accommodated to the nines. They were treated as well as they could be treated while they were in this facility. They were given the best food. They were supervised 24/7. They had TVs in their rooms, and they were given video games. They had movies to watch. They could watch TV. They were given one-on-one learning, so they were still getting an education, and a one-on-one education, which is very expensive. And a lot of people were not happy with that, considering, these boys who had murdered a young child were now getting like the best of the best learning, one-on-one learning, and they were getting it for free when it is an expensive thing to have on the outside world. And only after a year of their sentence were both boys actually allowed to leave the juvie completely. They were able to go out into the outside world. They could go to parks, they could go to malls. It was for a small period of time and they were supervised. However, they were allowed to socialize in the outside world, which is mind-blowing to me. The defense that the people who were supervising the boys had for this is that they wanted to, acclimate the boys to have a proper social life as well as they possibly could, and really prepare them for the outside world, so when they get out of juvie, they're able to, mandate their life accordingly. Now, in 1999, it was brought to the attention of the European court that the boys' trial, Robert and John's trial in 1993, was not impartial. Now, due to this concern, the trial and the sentencing was reviewed, and this review actually determined that the trial was not impartial, and the boys were actually going to be released. Ultimately, though, the boys ended up being released in June 2001, but you can imagine the uproar and the anger that this brought upon everyone. Everyone was so frustrated and so angry and so upset that these boys were being let out into the public again. And here's where I'm so curious to hear your argument on this, because when the boys were released, they were both given completely new identities. That means new names, new passports, new licenses, new bank accounts, literally new social security numbers, new everything, which is expensive, by the way, but let's just put that aside. It's very expensive to do that. And both boys were given new identities. That way they would be able to go out into the public and really start fresh, essentially. It was a way for them to be able to go out and start a new life. Now, as you can imagine, James's family was furious at this, and to this day, they're still trying to get these new identities lifted and have their actual identities be known. So both boys were released. They had new names, they had new identities. They were ordered to not contact James's family, and they were also ordered not to contact each other. That was the big rule that they had, the two big rules that they had against them. But only 9 years later, Jon Venables ended up re-offending. He got charged with child pornography, and he ended up being arrested. He had downloaded 57 indecent pictures of children over a 12-month period. He pled guilty for this and was put in prison for 2 years. Now, during the time of all this, though, it was actually brought to the attention of law enforcement that Jon had discussed to 2 different people his real identity. So he's given this whole new identity, this whole new, chance to have a fresh start, and he goes off and he tells 2 people his real identity over the past 9 years that he has been released. And obviously this was a very infuriating for authorities, because it's just like, you're given so much. How much more can they give you? And so because of this, they actually put him in jail for another 2 years just for the fact that he released his true identity, because they had to give him a new identity because of this. So a whole new set of everything we just talked about was given to Jon after it was revealed that he had told people who he actually was. And so they put him in jail for 2 years because they wanted him to be stuck in there and know, A, you can't go walking around telling people your true identity, and B, it's safer for him to be in prison. That way he doesn't have the chance to go and tell people, if that makes sense. So after his collective 4 years spent in prison, he was released. However, in 2017, Jon was arrested again for possession of child pornography. And I'm going to look over here so I get this exactly right. He admitted to having over 392 category A images, 148 category B images, and 160 category C images. And just to clarify, the rankings of those, the A, B, and C, are basically from the worst of the worst, and then it just digresses from there. Just to clarify though, literally none of that is okay. None of that, regardless of the ranking, is okay. And so after this was discovered, Jon was sentenced again to 3 years and 4 months in prison, which he is currently serving under a new name. So James's parents throughout all of this have tried and fought tooth and nail to get the identities of Robert and Jon to be released. And the argument here is, wouldn't you want to know, like, for the safety of the people around you, wouldn't you want to know? Don't you want to know who you live next to? Don't you want to know who your coworker is? And the defense argument in this is that they were 10 years old and maybe they could change. Clearly Jon has not changed. We haven't heard from Robert, but clearly Jon has not changed. He is still in prison right now for child pornography. So there is definitely something that has not changed there. And James's murder was brutal and torturous and so sadistic and purposeful that I personally don't believe, this is just my opinion, you guys can give me yours in the comments, I don't believe that these boys deserve any special treatment in regards to, protecting their identity. Who cares? Why are we trying to protect them? I guess is my point, is why do we protect them? Again, I would want to know who my neighbor is. I would want to know, just to know. You deserve the right to know. Why don't the people around them who are innocent don't deserve the right to know, but the 2 people who committed these horrific crimes deserve protection, if that makes sense. So that is all we have today, you guys. I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say about this case. Again, James's murder was brutal and torturous and so undeserving, and I personally believe that Robert and Jon should still be in prison for it, but I definitely also believe that their identities should not be protected. As far as Denise, she has gone on to have another son. I believe she remarried. She had another son whom she named Michael James in honor of James Bulger. So that is where she is at, and both James's mother and father are working countlessly to try and get the identity of Robert and Jon to be released. So let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments below. And with that being said, you guys, that is all from me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another true crime video here on my YouTube channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I make videos 3 days a week, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday. You should subscribe and join the family. I love you guys so much. I'll be back in a couple days with a brand new one. Bye, guys.